Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to Product Academy. Woo! Yay! Well, we have some many first-time attendees. Raise your hand if this is your first Product Academy. Awesome. And then we've got repeats. Who are the repeats? Yay. Awesome. We're so happy to have you all here today. I'm Erin Bryan. It's nice to meet you if I haven't met you yet. This is one of the most fun programs that I get to work on. I wanted to start by showing you a quick video that sort of highlights what the experience is like and what we really hope that you get out of today and tomorrow with us.
I'm the Senior Director of Data Science here at HomeAway.
I'm Katie Slesser, and I am a Senior Product Manager on the Traveler side.
Jay Wagray, Senior Manager for the Traveler mobile apps team.
I'm Bobby Burns. I'm the Director of Product Management for the Traveler shopping experience. My favorite part of the last Product Academy was having insiders that you would never get exposed to in our industry come and actually speak to us about what they see behind the scenes and where they see the industry going.
I don't have a lot of product management experience in my background, and I figured it'd be a great way for me to get introduced.
It's very difficult. I will say though, I think our experience with the last Product Academy was really interesting because the pre-work was also pretty difficult, but it gave you such a great background.
In the last Product Academy, we read a book called Hooked, and we had the author come and speak to us, and that is something that we actually use day to day as a team upstairs.
So one of the things I value about Product Academy is I look back at other companies I've been and they have these kind of classes and it's like same old, same old. You literally have leading experts coming and sharing some of the secrets or kind of approaches that you're just never going to find in a book or you're never going to put in a YouTube video.
This upcoming Product Academy is all about data science and using machine learning to improve our site experience for travelers and partners alike.
It's going to be really fun to learn more about how that actually applies, how it's done, doing it the right way, and learning from some of the best.
Imagine I'll bone up on your statistics a little bit, but also take off your drive to getting the product done and put on a creative, innovative hat.
Awesome. How great is that video? And our actors and actresses are our very own, and they did such a good job. Kayla Chance, who's in the back of the room, actually put this video together. It's awesome. Thank you, Kayla. So share it on social media. All right, to kick off our day, I'm going to invite Anna and Justin up.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
We don't have noisemakers. We do have noisemakers? Okay, so we'll have to, you know the drill, we'll have to do this again. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second Product Academy session. Big shout out to 50 new people who are joining us for the first time. Today we're talking about data science, and I'm super chuffed that only 24 people in this room are actually data scientists. Okay, so back in 2014, a member of my team said, I think we should buy a couple of licenses for this thing called LinkedIn. There's about 8 million subscribers. I think we should keep an eye on it. So I said, okay, let's check it out. What is it? So basically how it worked, if you remember back in days, you would put emails of people you would know, and that's how you grow your network. So I thought, hold on a second, that's a very awkward social experience. I'm supposed to go out there and find people by entering their email addresses into the system. So if I knew their emails, I wouldn't be searching through this network. So what is it all about? So fast forward a couple of years, and LinkedIn introduced this thing called People You May Know. So Jonathan Goldman joined around that time, end of 2006, and they realized that people you may know achieve 30% higher click-through than any other prompt. I also remember back in the days my husband got home and he said, wow, this thing really works. So all of a sudden you no longer have just your friends and your uni friends that you had at Facebook and your other network, but you actually tap into the professional network that was relevant. So he could tap into his very niche, smart energy distribution and pricing geeks network, so all 17 of them across the world, and they were all on LinkedIn. Fast forward to 2008, a term data scientist was coined. In 2010, everyone wanted to hire them. 2017, every single profession, every single function wants to build data science skill set into their skills. And this is why you're here, I'm hoping. How many of you have heard about our new trust culture model? Hands up. Oh, wow, that's pretty much everyone. So trust model, so we're rebuilding the culture around trust. So our 5 values are scientific mindset, openness, participation, one team, and mastery. So today we have a special focus on mastery. Growth mindset is a driving force behind trust model. So everyone in this room, actually, without you knowing or not, is living the growth mindset. For those of you who put hours, tens of hours, not only to complete the homework, but actually to learn how to code, you're already on the road to mastery through growth mindset. How many of you were coding before this assignment? And how many of you had to code for this assignment? Okay, so that's about a quarter of the room, or a third of the room. So thank you for pushing yourselves in order to be here. And thank you for helping now data science team to pick the most interesting and relevant problems to be solved for HomeAway. Now you must be wondering, okay, we pushed ourselves, but how did data science team push themselves? Because they know all of these things. Well, actually, I've been really humbled and impressed over the past few days to see data scientists, most of them, I think 90% they told me are blue on Insights profiles, really push themselves, honing their presenting, social skills, working to come here on stage, public speaking, and work with all of you at the table to make sure that they can tell stories through data. So thank you very much for bringing growth mindset to Product Academy. Okay, so we're going to solve some difficult problems today and tomorrow. So in order to start us on a problem-solving mode, you know the drill. There's always an icebreaker. There's absolutely always an icebreaker. So people who are here for 120 are now laughing. I promise we won't be dancing on the stage today. Or not, you never know. So this is the game. It's called Untangler. So it's played at the table level, although you might find it difficult to play if you have less than, let's say, 8 people on the table. So the idea is that each group has to untangle themselves without letting go of hands. So can I please ask you all to stand up? Tables with less than 8. Ooh, that's going to be interesting. So each person joins right hands with another person in the group, but there cannot be person immediately to your left or right. Right hands, joining right hands, and it can be your immediate left or right. I love this mini group, Justin Rouse, mini group, okay? Okay, are you there? So, did you join your right hand with a person not immediately to your left or right? We'll give a couple of groups a few more seconds. Okay. John, did you give your right hand to someone? John James? Did you give your... Oh, you did? Oh, you did. Okay. Now you give your left hand to someone who is not your immediate left or right. Okay, guys, don't start untangling. No. Don't start untangling. When I give you a sign, okay? So is everyone holding people's hands on their left and right? Are you ready? Okay, on the count of 3, let's see who is the fastest team to untangle themselves without letting go of your hands. So 1, 2, 3, go. Well, no, you need to be in a chain. You need to be in one chain. Oh my God, that's bad. Oh my God, you're holding hands? Stay there, you can let go, but well done, you team. We'll come back to you in a second. No. You still don't. You still don't. You still don't. You're still tangled. Now you're not. Okay. That's 24 seconds. You're still tangled. No, you let go of your hands. You did. Yes, you did. Yes. Try again. Try again. Oh, okay, so you cannot hold hands. Okay. Okay, 38 seconds. Are you actually detangled? Yes, you are. Hey, guys, I didn't see how much time you took. About 30 seconds. It looks like we have some teams permanently locked. Struggle is real. We'll give them 20 more seconds. William, that looks complicated. That looks very complicated. Can somebody take a photo of these guys? We want to remind them they never untangle themselves. Woohoo! Well done. Bigger the team, more complicated to get untangled. What are these guys doing? You're nearly there, you're nearly there. Central team, you can do it. Go on, Gareth. We asked you to detangle, not to dance. William is dancing beautifully. Marco, are you enjoying yourself? Not. Okay, I'd like you to give the guys a big round of applause and say, not yet. So, in the spirit of growth mindset, you didn't fail, you're not there yet. So you can try later. Thank you very much. Big round of applause for Katrina's team that took 14 seconds to detangle themselves. Did you guys use some algorithm to do that? You need to share. Okay. So very quickly around today's expectations, I think you figured out there's a bit of a pre-work required for this session, right? I love this session because no angry comments and complaints came to me. They all went to Justin Rao. So thank you for that, Justin, okay? You make my life and job much easier. There's going to be pre-work. For those of you who are here for the first time, there's going to be pre-work for every single session. Why do we do that? That's because we want to have discussions when we don't discuss the basics, we don't discuss the definition of what things are, but we actually discuss their practical implementation in day-to-day work. So you should have expectation of people who ask you about the program to tell them how high the bar is. Ajay did that beautifully in the video. Thank you very much. That being said, attendance is not mandatory. We absolutely don't take it against you if you don't take part in the next session because you don't find that topic to be very relevant. However, if you're in, we're expected to go in with all the marbles. We expect you to be super engaged. We don't use electronics during the day. It's all about the listening, processing, debating, asking right questions. So part of the housekeeping rule, a couple of more housekeeping rules. We try to be very respectful when we Q&A, not to hijack the mics because we have limited time for Q&A. So try to keep your questions short and concise and come back and ask another one if you have them. We also love to hear from you and have expectations on how we share this knowledge, how we don't just end up being informed, but how we practically pass it to our teams and how we test it real time. And we do have expectation for everyone to have fun. So over the next 2 days, we're going to spend first day purely on learning. How do we become more scientific? We're also covering reverse engineering. Again, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, reverse engineering is going to feature in pretty much every Product Academy. This is the ongoing learning that we're just going to practice together in every single session. And day 2 is about the application. And we have a little hackathon contest for everyone. Very quick look at the agenda. So we have Keynote, Susan Athey joining us today. Justin is going to come in a minute to introduce her. We're going into Q&A until 11. Break for lunch and come back for a bridge session to see how we're already doing in this field and where should we be pushing ourselves more. The afternoon session is focused on Zillow, reverse engineering. Tomorrow is our hackathon day. If you want to share any learnings or impressions, these are our hashtags on social media, Team HomeAway and Product Academy during the breaks. And we also have Slido if you have any questions, and we ran out of questions. We'll welcome use of electronics during Q&A. If we run out of time, we'll try and get back to all of your questions. So that's Product Academy 2 hashtag. So presenters for the day, I'm thrilled to welcome Justin Rao to the stage as our MC. Some of you who were attending Brett Gerson's session about a month ago, Brett joined one of the data science classes, and when he came to the stage a few minutes later, he said, I've never seen a group of people who are not data scientists working so diligently on data science problems, and they didn't seem to be forced to be there, right? So this is all you. For a bridge session, we're joined by Brent Schneemann and Sophie Mann. And in the afternoon, Katrina Reel and Mike Gallion. So, Justin, thank you very much for emceeing today.
Sure.
And over to you.
Great. Use the clicker, I think, just one more.
Yes, you do.
I think it's just I need one click. Okay, so first, thank you all for doing the pre-work. When we set up the class, I think I underestimated to some extent how much time it would take everyone, and that's natural because I, to some extent, know how to do that stuff. And people told me the hours it took to do the coding assignment or the conceptual assignment. And I don't know how to ask, who thinks they spent more than 20 hours on the coding assignment? 30 hours. 40 hours, right? So most people, I think, when I did between 20 and 30 hours, one assignment. It's part of your, no one gave you that extra time in that week, right? So that's on the weekend, that's at night. The conceptual assignment was no easier in terms of learning the concepts. And I would guess to be able to go from not having much background in statistics and machine learning and passing that exam would take 40 to 60 hours of pretty hard work. So, wow, that's impressive. In full disclosure, in the last 8 weeks or 12 weeks, I haven't put 40 hours into learning something new. Steve Davis is always trying to get me to learn like Node.js or all this crap he says I don't know. And I haven't learned that stuff. So everyone in this room has, over the past 12 weeks, advanced their human capital well more than I have in that time period, which is humbling. And I think everyone deserves a round of applause for that. Now, I didn't realize when I made the class that it would make me a little less well-liked around the company. And I'm not joking about that. As in, if I had thought of that, I like to be liked, and so I would have maybe been a little more gun-shy. So for the people that struggled with it and the people that fought through, those are the people in this room, and wow, you really did it. We set a high bar, and I am humbled by it. The payoff to some extent is today, and we have with us I couldn't imagine a better speaker. Okay, so I'm going to give you the intro to Susan with some of the stuff you can read on our Wikipedia page, and then I'm going to layer in some stuff that you can't read on our Wikipedia page that I did not clear with her first, so we're going to see how this goes. Susan Athey is, in my opinion, if I was going into any room in the world and I wanted to bring one economist, I would bring Susan, period. And I don't know who number 2 is. Okay? So it's not just I who feel that way. In 2007, Susan won an award called the Bates-Clark Medal, which is awarded to the best economist under the age of 40. This is an award that's harder to win than the Nobel Prize. So she will win a Nobel Prize one day, for sure. You will be able to tell people you saw a Nobel Prize winner. But that award is harder to win. So you already saw someone that won the award. That's harder to win. She's a member of you could name sort of a prestigious academic institution like the National Academy of Sciences. She's a member, right? So this is an absolutely world-class scientist, world-class economist. So that's the things you can get off our Wikipedia page. Here's some things about Susan for me. I wouldn't have this job without Susan for 2 reasons. One is literally she's the one that recommended me. So, but more fundamentally, 6 years ago when I was changing jobs, I met Susan at Stanford, and I, based on her guidance, joined Microsoft and then worked under her wing and learned from her for years. And it was the most formative experience of my life. And through that, I mean, Susan's intimidating and intelligent, and I heard all these things about her, but I always just liked her, you know? And I felt that she always just liked me, and I count her now as a friend. Susan is a powerhouse and famous for all these weird things. So when she was an assistant professor at MIT, she was famous for sleeping in her office. And what I find funniest about that is I believe she thought it was odd that other people didn't do that. So everyone thought she was a weirdo for sleeping in her office, and she thought everyone else was a weirdo for not. That's the kind of person we're talking about here. That's a powerhouse, okay? And the moment I knew Susan and I were truly friends is about 3 months ago. We're on a Skype call. I think it's like 6 p.m. Central. And at the end of the call, Susan just looks at me and goes, "Hey, Justin, you look like shit." And I was like, "What?" She's like, "I think you need some rest. Take care of yourself, okay? You might burn yourself out." Wow. That's what she said. She can confirm it. And so I'm just absolutely, I couldn't imagine someone I'd rather introduce and bring to Product Academy than Susan Athey. So Susan, I think let's welcome with a round of applause. This is a great moment for me. Please, welcome.
Well, so thank you so much for having me here. Gosh, I should have prepared some of the things you didn't know about Justin, but next time. Next time, exactly. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, so I'm going to talk today as sort of Susan Athey, Stanford professor, not Expedia board member. So I, may shoot from the hip sometimes. I might say something that isn't fully thought through with all of the data and experience that you guys have. So please take it as a not as anything too authoritative where I'm speaking without authority. So there's so many things. It's actually really hard sometimes to come in and talk to a group of experts. I spend a lot of time working with newer marketplaces that are in the early stages. And this room is full of people who are living all of this stuff day in and day out. Despite that, I think it can be very helpful to sort of step back and think about the bigger picture framework of what business you're in and what the themes are. So I want to spend the first part of my talk kind of talking through some of the conceptual ideas from platform economics that I've seen across a lot of different marketplaces. And then in the second part, I'll dive into some of the experiences I've had with trying to translate those into measurement. And And as Justin mentioned, we met each other at Microsoft, and a lot of my cutting of my teeth in really the online managing these digital marketplaces came from the early days of Bing. It wasn't Bing then. It went through about 6 brands before it became Bing. But you don't know anything about that, right? You guys have only one brand. Sorry. Okay. Anyways, so, let's see. Is this clicker working? Oh, there we go. Okay, so we all know that marketplaces are super important, and in particular that market design matters. And so the part that, when you're here, like you're in a marketplace business, so that part isn't a choice. The choice is how do you actually manage and optimize your market? And when I first came in to work at the predecessors to Bing, we kind of knew what business we were in, and the question was, how could you get as close to Google as you could? There are lots and lots of marketplace design decisions that matter. And again, some of those are predetermined, but I think one interesting thing is that many marketplaces go through an evolution. And I think that the evolution of the HomeAway brands is really consistent with what we've seen in a lot of other marketplaces as well. So, you have these big market design decisions like, how do I price? Who prices? Who sets the price? Is it centralized? Is it decentralized? What's the fee structure? And how do the algorithms work? And so, we've seen evolutions across many businesses in terms of how they operate. So even something like Uber or Lyft, in the beginning, they're just sort of taking a fixed cut. But then over time, they give themselves the ability to dynamically set prices both for the buy side and the sell side, both to respond to local elasticities and also to ensure that you have adequate market thickness in all markets. When we think about other types of marketplaces that are a little bit closer to HomeAway, things like TaskRabbit, where you have active buyers and sellers, and both sides have to agree to a match, we often see sort of initial market designs. In HomeAway, it's like just basically a listing or a posting, and something like TaskRabbit, which was actually just bought by IKEA. You would start out where the buyer would hold an auction and say, hey, this is what I want, and sellers would bid for it. But they quickly figured out the transaction costs of that model were too high. And so then they moved to something that was more transactional. In this case, they made the workers post a price and made it closer to instant book. And of course, on eBay, we saw a similar evolution. The auction sort of slowly died on eBay because the frictions were too great and the conversion rates were too low, and a much bigger shift to buy it now, where the seller sets the prices, and they also push towards fast, cheap shipping. Now, in the case of TaskRabbit, it wasn't really so much about competition that evolved. It was just that it was just too hard for buyers to find a match with the old system. With eBay, we also saw the competitive dynamics, that you just can't compete with Amazon in a system where it takes a couple of days to figure out whether you've bought something. And so it just became an imperative to push there. And they really had a lot of challenges because they had to squeeze the seller side of the market, who was a very vocal group, and that really felt they had entitlement to various features and ways that things operated at eBay. But over time, they needed to squeeze those sellers to make things efficient. So I don't know if probably not a lot of people here saw Todd Lutwak speak. He's one of my favorite guest speakers in my MBA classes, and I actually recommended him to speak at Expedia. So I think a few of you saw that. But he told stories. He was the VP of selling at eBay, and over time he had to push the selling side to be more and more efficient. At some point, he said people came to his office and started saying, they should take away your title. You should no longer be VP of selling, because all you care about are the buyers. And he says that he got T-shirts printed up, which basically said, eBay creating great experiences for buyers in order to create transactions for sellers. So it was actually a little bit shorter than that. But anyways, I forgot the exact wording. But the point was that when you are managing a marketplace, you have to understand where the competition is. You have to understand where the margins were, and so on. And as eBay had to compete more and more with Amazon, they needed to create great experiences for the buyers. And part of that meant that the sellers were going to lose their surplus. He talked about another example where they wanted to force the sellers to kind of ship the same day or ship very quickly or incentivize them to do so. And then the sales rep says, but what about my shippers in Alaska? They can't get to the post office. And he basically, the way he tells it, he says, well, I'm sorry, fuck the shippers in Alaska. We have buyers in Iowa, and they want their stuff. And so in some cases, you have to make the hard choices. But figuring out what those hard choices are is actually a pretty big challenge. Because, of course, it's not just a priori obvious that you care more about the buyer in Iowa than you do about the seller in Alaska. Maybe at the beginning of the marketplace, you have to care about those sellers because you really need those sellers. But then at some point, the market matures. The buyers are the ones that you have to pay attention to. So that's a great story, but how do you know? How do you know when it's time to switch, and how do you know exactly how hard you can push the different sides of the market at different times? That's one of the things that makes this business so fun and interesting, but also so challenging. Okay. So when we think about the overall strategy that we're engaged in, I think one good starting point is to remember that some platforms and marketplaces are super profitable, but they are not all. In fact, many can be quite competitive. So if you talk to a venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, they'll say, invest all your money in me, and then I'll go invest in marketplaces, because marketplaces are monopolies. They're more buyers, more sellers, more buyers. The first mover wins, and it's all good. You'll make $1 zillion. Okay. So, well, we kind of know that sometimes you can be the first mover and someone else can come and even pass you. There's no kind of entitlement to long-run monopoly. And in fact, and then when you have competing marketplaces, you can have a quite competitive life in some cases. So one of the things I want to spend a few minutes talking about, and I'll think through in a few slides, is when do you just have a nice, easy life as a fat, happy monopolist? And when is actually the world pretty competitive and maybe perennially competitive? So just to start, we can think about, I have a little taxonomy. This is my own taxonomy for just business models and economics for 4 different types of platforms. The first are the straightforward matchmakers, marketplaces, and exchanges. And that would include HomeAway. And looking there, if we look at profitability, actually a lot of them are not super high margin. In some cases, we see it. So, and DoubleClick has, for example, attained a pretty high and healthy margins. But in e-commerce, we see actually pretty low margins and generally profiting off of volume. Of course, in the long run, Amazon may take over the world, but in the medium term, they're profiting more from distribution and efficiencies and not super high margins. Then we have ad-supported media and internet websites. Of course, we think about the Facebooks, the Googles, and so on. These are businesses where you attract users and then try to sell access to them to advertisers. There's some of the most profitable companies in the history of the universe. Generally, when they have become profitable, it's because they're super big and because they have their own dedicated ad platform. So if you think about Facebook and Google, it's not just that they have a lot of users and they sell them to advertisers, but they have their own marketplace as well, and it's customized for their own platform. So Google combines the ad marketplace with the website. But still, even with this awesome business, you have to be big enough in order to cover your fixed cost and your R&D. So, something like Bing was very profitable on a per user basis, but you had to cover this like $1.5 billion of R&D, plus you had to actually pay a lot to acquire some of your users, and so it made it basically like a break-even business, even at fairly large scale. And something like Zillow is another example. It's a bit smaller, but it has a very targeted audience, and it has a dedicated ad platform where real estate agents bid for access to those consumers. And so by having its own ad platform and specialized inventory, that's how it stays profitable. The general news website just has a very hard time. Transaction systems, I won't talk about that too much today, but the Visa MasterCard juggernaut is one of the most profitable things in the history of the world. It's been sued for antitrust violations everywhere. Their business model's a bit different. One of the ways that the reasons they're so profitable are that the user, the consumer, doesn't see the fees that are being charged. So the user is indifferent between cash and credit card. The merchants, on the other hand, get charged a fee for access to those consumers. And because the users who make the purchase choice don't see the fee, they can charge high fees to the merchants as long as they have lots of users. So that's been a really hard business to break into. And of course, in software platforms, also some of the most profitable businesses ever. But even there, they're actually not all profitable. So you think, well, they're profitable because more users, more applications, more users. And so Windows should rule the world forever, right? Well, kind of. One of the places actually that's interesting where it's been to contrast with Windows is Xbox and gaming platforms. Those have actually struggled to be profitable. They also have more users, more applications, more users, but they burn a lot of it in advance on R&D. So I worked some on the Xbox business at Microsoft. It's a really tough business because you're going to say, all right, I'm going to spend a couple $2 billion to build something like 6 years before it comes to market. So like you're building when an iPad doesn't exist, and you're going to launch like after an iPad. Is ubiquitous. So it's a pretty challenging business from the R&D perspective. Also one where you can just invest more and more and more in R&D, and so it's easy to burn it all away in an arms race. The other thing that makes the Xbox business very challenging is that rather than having a very fragmented seller side, it has actually hits. And so hit games are very problematic for profits. Why? Well, if you're a hit game franchise, something like a Halo, then as a game developer that if you go exclusive on Sony or if you go exclusive on Xbox, you're going to bring users with you. You're going to drive users. And so those games extract all the surplus. So again, 2 or 3 years before launch, you're going to have to make business deals with the games and you're going to pay them to be exclusive with your platform. And they can say, hey, if you don't give me all the surplus you expect, I'll walk. So that's also a very hard data-driven business. One of the reasons I worked on it was because I was trying to value these exclusive titles. It's really tough because you're forecasting like many millions of dollars that you want to spend to get these exclusive titles, and you have to figure out, well, this title is going to attract more users, and this user is going to attract more titles, and this titles are going to attract more users. And you have to work all of that out and get it right. And if you don't measure all those things and account for them, you'll lose the bidding. So I worked on the Xbox One. I was brought in to try to justify higher prices for some of the launch titles for the Xbox One. People were nervous about it. There were big standard errors. There were big, I couldn't say with certainty. Like, I don't have the data to tell you for sure you're going to get your money back. People got nervous. They didn't get all the launch titles, and they had a very unsuccessful launch. So this is a business that's not for the faint of heart. And one of the things that I learned from that is that in these marketplace businesses, if you don't have a capability in measurement and if you don't trust it, you will lose because you're competing against people who do. But they are hard problems because no data scientist can manufacture data, right? I mean, some of the questions I've been asked in all these businesses are really hard. I was asked like, how much would it be worth it for Bing to go from 8% to 30% of the market by buying Yahoo's search business? Okay, let's extrapolate. Let's multiply our market by 4 and figure out how many more advertisers and how many more users and how much better the algorithms are and how many more advertisers, how many more users, and let's put a number on it, and then let's go make an offer for $35 billion. It's like scary. And I'm like, wait, you're going to use this number? You know, very scary. So, but that's the nature of the beast in these businesses. We have to measure the unmeasurable. And sometimes somebody's like holding a gun to your head and saying, like, Susan, we're going to make an offer tomorrow, and we have no other number. It's going to be your number. Give me a number. Very scary. So, you know, I had to also learn to kind of come down from my academic perch where I'm like, okay, well, these confidence intervals are very wide, and say, all right, well, we have to make a decision here. How are we going to make a decision? And one of the things I learned about how to do that was really to you know, say these are the unmeasurables and these are the measurables, and I've put numbers here, but I haven't put numbers here. A real hard lesson I learned there was that people only paid attention to the things I put the numbers on. And I had these qualitative points, and then like when people went off and made offers, they didn't do anything. If it was a bullet point and there wasn't a number next to it, they didn't do anything with it. So figuring out how to speak to my audience, like my audience was some MBAs who were going to be at 2 in the morning writing the Dear Jerry Yang letter. Like, I needed to have everything super organized for them, and I needed to have a number on everything, even if I couldn't make it data-driven. So I would say, here are the things where I have data, but I have to put numbers on the other things too, and make clear that they're guesses. But at the end of the day, they're not going to think about it. They're just going to write a number down. So those were some early challenges I had in making all this stuff data-driven. OK, so I'm going to walk through a little bit of Platform Economics 101. This is the Cliff Notes to a 10-week class that I teach. So, you know, bear with me. These are the highlights. And I can make the slides available afterwards as well if anybody's interested. In fact, I have lots of slides. I have slides from a 10-week class. So if anybody wants more reading material, feel free to shoot me a note. OK, so Platform Economics 101. What are some of the main considerations that drive platform performance and profitability? First of all, really the first and most important thing is that for platforms, transaction volume is central. And so relative to a regular non-two-sided business, for a regular non-two-sided business, you raise the price, you get a little more revenue, you sell to a few less people. That's a simple trade-off. In a two-sided market, you raise the price, you lose the sale today, but then you also lose people on the other side of the market, you lose their sales tomorrow, and then it feeds back to the first side. So using kind of standard pricing logic always leads you astray in platform businesses. When I first got to Microsoft, I went out, my first visit, Steve Ballmer invited me. They called in all their executives. It was a little bit weird and terrifying. But I heard all of their issues, and they were inviting me to come consult for them. The next week, I had actually prearranged that I was going to talk to a business-to-business auto auction company. Okay, and so I met with a guy who was running one of these local things. He didn't have a college degree, and he was like a car salesman. But when I went to Microsoft, I had the feeling that they weren't really sure even how to manage their platform business. I went to the car salesman guy, and he was like, look, I'm a middleman. What I got to do is maximize transaction volume. I've got to make my market more efficient, and if we want to, what he talked about the things he had done, like with pictures and inspections and so on. If I get more information into this market, I make it more efficient. Then I will eventually win. I don't need to know how, but I just need to make sure this market is efficient as possible. So Susan, help me make this market efficient. And I was like, wow. Like, here's a bunch of guys like kind of drawing arrows on the whiteboard and like talking kind of very abstractly about this and that. And then here is this guy who's running a marketplace without a college degree, but he understood the business he was in. So it's just something to always remember that we can kind of overcomplicate things. But at the end of the day, when you're a marketplace, you want to be big, you want to grow. If you make a transaction happen that wouldn't have otherwise happened, that is good. And so, when you think about metrics and managing a marketplace, like having a North Star in terms of just, did I make a match, is always the best place to start. You can tie yourself into knots saying, well, I'm going to extract a little more margin here, I'm going to extract a little more margin there. Actually, now we've lost our distinguished CEO, Dara, but recently I had a conversation with him where, I was sort of talking about, short-term margins versus long-term margins, he had an analogy that was even better than any I had used, which is like, kind of fees and add-ons are kind of like opioids. Like you get addicted to them, and they can continue to tax and drag your marketplace down. It's very hard to give them away because they are a revenue stream. But, if you can, you want to build sort of healthy profits, which come from things that improve efficiency and expand transaction volume. That's something where everybody wins, and so on. So raising prices has feedback effects, and what you really need to do is determine how to charge to minimize distortions. So you want to think about, I want to grow this pie big. I have to believe that if I make the pie bigger, I can get a piece of it. And then I want to figure out how to take my piece without slowing down transaction volume. And that means figuring out which side of the market is less elastic, or figuring out pricing structures like fixed fees versus marginal fees and so on that maximize volume. So even in the absence of competition, all of these things hold true. Even if you're a monopoly, you still think primarily about transaction volume. It's not just a competitive thing. You want to make investments that maximize total surplus. So why do I kind of start with this and really harp on it? Because I think sometimes there are investments that you can make where it's maybe difficult to measure how you're going to get the money back. So a big category like this is seller tools. So you build a tool for advertisers on Bing, it makes all of your sellers more efficient. Well, how do you measure the benefit to you? It might come over months or years because everybody's being a little bit more efficient. But yet, it's kind of obvious that if you do something once, if you have an intern build a tool in 2 months in the summer, and you save 100,000 or 200,000 or 1 million people from spending that same time, that clearly grows the pie. So even though it's hard to completely measure, exactly what you're getting out of it, if it so obviously grows the pie, if the ROI for the whole pie is 1,000 to 1, then probably you're going to get at least 1,000th of the surplus, and you should just do it, even though it's hard to measure. Okay. Broadly, the measurement challenges in implementing this is, well, how do I know what the value of a customer is? It's great to say, in principle, I want to grow the pie, but how do I know which people grow the pie? I need to figure out market by market which types of sellers are really incremental versus which types of sellers are crowding each other out. I need to figure out which buyers are bringing surplus to the platform versus which buyers are just crowding each other out. Understanding that and understanding their value, that's like so hard. That's very hard to measure. And that's why the science of marketplace measurement is something that advances over years. And that's really some of the sources of strategic advantage for the biggest marketplaces, that they've actually had 10 or 15 years to figure out how to manage their marketplaces. And you're just a lot better than at the beginning. And you can't call McKinsey to tell you how to do this stuff. You have to invent it yourself. With competition, you get even greater challenges in this measurement because now there's sort of unique supply and unique demand. So if you have a higher-end buyer, you need to think about how valuable that is for attracting higher-end sellers who don't want to rent to a bunch of teenagers. If you think about what's unique, why do people still come to HomeAway when they could just go to Airbnb? It's generally going to be because they know they can't find everything they want on Airbnb. At the moment that they can find everything they want on Airbnb, you're screwed. Because who wants to shop twice? So understanding the value of that unique supply, that you have to think from the perspective of the user. Why am I going to multiple sites? And you would like them to just come to you. If you have all of the high-end houses, then why would I go to Airbnb? I don't go to Airbnb when I go to Lake Tahoe because all of the stuff is on VRBO or HomeAway. But if that changed, you would have a big trouble. So understanding what really differentiates you and then being willing to go to the end of the world to make sure that you remain differentiated is something that's very important but also hard to measure. So then when I think about competition, the cross-site network effects are, of course, a barrier to entry. There's a chicken and egg problem. More buyers, more sellers, more sellers, more buyers. But that barrier is not always as great as it seems. If you can segment the consumers by taste on either side of the market, a competitor can steal consumers on that side and then attract the other side. So, Airbnb came in with an underserved market or an unserved market. They got the users on that, they got the sellers and the buyers on that side in a vertical. but then they can expand. And that's a very common playbook. And so generally, if you're trying to be all things to all people, somebody can come in and pick a niche, do better in that niche, but then expand to compete with you in all of your core businesses. And that's a perennial challenge if you're trying to be broad. So generally, horizontal platforms are vulnerable to vertical entry. We also use this at Bing in the late 2000s. We tried to figure out, well, where is Google weak? Google was weak in travel. They had crappy travel results. So we made a partnership with ITA, which was the best travel search engine. We got the best. We had much better travel results. Then you get all the travel consumers. You can get the travel advertisers and get things going in that vertical. It was working so well that Google bought ITA. But it's still a good strategy. Another aspect of this competition is crowding. So the fact that sellers compete with other sellers. So like sellers on eBay don't make very high margins. So a smaller platform, if they attracted consumers, might be able to attract some of those sellers because they're not doing very well. And that's actually something HomeAway can think about as well. If all of the stuff on Airbnb, all of the good and bad consumers and the good and bad homes are all there sort of crowding things out, you can compete by making sure that the people that you're serving the best actually get better visibility and better search. Now, the problem is, of course, that if you have good enough search and algorithms, Airbnb can make Airbnb feel high-end to me and low-end to someone else, and they don't actually have to pay the cost. So that's where like the search algorithms and the sort are super important. And I would just say, like, while you have this unique supply, you need to get ahead then, because if Airbnb can make Airbnb feel like a luxury place, they can beat you. And I'm friends with the CEO of Quora. I don't know how many of you have used Quora before, but at some point I posted some articles on there and I got 2 million page views. And I thought, I said to the CEO, I'm like, because they did like a special thing where I was like featured. And I said, I didn't even know there was 2 million people on Quora. I was like, I thought Quora was a Silicon Valley thing. He's like, well, exactly. Quora makes me think it's a Silicon Valley thing. They make you think Quora is an Austin thing. They make people in the Midwest feel like it's a Midwestern thing. And they've basically invested all in their R&D in making it feel like a local community to all of these different communities. And that is technically possible. So you have to fight while you have that advantage until they catch up. And finally, another important point for you guys especially is uniquely differentiated matching preferences can increase the benefits to scale in a single platform. So if I want my Uber exactly next to me, I want my house to be in exactly the right distance from the beach or the ski resort, I really want my perfect house. That means that if I really want to go to the platform that has everything, I want to make sure I'm not missing anything. And so if one firm gets ahead and has everything, it's very hard to claw your way back. Because why would you go somewhere that had a subset of the first place? It's very important to keep that unique supply. Okay. In terms of entry and competition, platform competition is very tough if it's inexpensive to multi-home on both sides, or if one of the sides that doesn't multi-home has some differentiation. So we'll come back to this in a bit, but if you think about like Uber and Lyft, it's pretty easy for you to just check both apps. If I did this yesterday, I usually use Uber. 12 minutes to my house, so I'm going to just open the Lyft app. 5 minutes, I'm going to pick that one. I had to develop that habit, but once you have that habit, it's pretty quick. And of course, over time, you could have apps that checked both and made it even easier for you to do that. And of course, for the drivers, there's no opportunity cost of keeping both apps on. And so when it's very easy for both sides to switch in real time, these can be actually like pretty tough platform competition. In particular, like if the seller side is not at capacity, so I'm an Uber driver and I'm not full. I'm sitting there waiting for my next ride. Of course I'm going to turn on all the apps. Of course I'm going to take the next ride. And if my property isn't rented, of course I'm going to want to rent. I'm going to try to list in different places to fill that excess supply. Another thing that can make it easy for someone to enter is when groups of sellers can be aggregated. So of course, this is one of the things Airbnb did when they got started, is they went and got whole collections of properties to list, so there would be something on their site. As you well know, the property managers, when they have a lot of supply together, you can get a lot of supply at once, so you don't just have to compete sort of and sign up everybody one by one. And that can make it easier for someone to enter. We also have to think about what's a motivation for the buy side to multi-home. So if there's heterogeneous offers, then they're going to multi-home. So if there's different platforms and all the offers are unique, then there's really a benefit from searching for the best offer. Unique supply on an entrance platform, like so if somebody comes in and they have something unique, then people are going to go there. And so if you were an Airbnb renter who was maybe indifferent between a small house and a room, then there's a reason to search at Airbnb because there's something you can get there that you can't get anywhere else. And generally, if the supply is ever changing, then that's going to motivate you to search and look at different platforms. Another just very important point is I've just talked about some reasons that it's can be easy or hard to enter. But gosh, I spent 8 years at Bing trying to claw back against Google. And some of these things, like once you get behind, it is just very expensive to come back. So when I think about your business, I really do think like you right now you're ahead in certain things, and just like don't lose that, because if it turned out that in certain cities all of the high-end supply was on Airbnb, then you've lost people's reason to come to you. There's strictly more there, and getting those people back is expensive. You have to subsidize them. You have to bribe them. And trying to bribe small businesses to invest time is actually really, really hard. You call up someone and you say, "Hi, I want you to advertise on Bing. We have very low prices." And they say, "I'm sorry, you've only got 15 or 10% of the market. It's just not worth my time." And of course, Justin and I both worked on this at Microsoft. Another big example of that was the Windows Phone. Basically, imagine somebody comes to you and they say, "Okay, here's we'll spend up to $10 billion, say, to make this thing successful." How would you spend it? Well, it turns out that even if you have basically a blank checkbook, it can sometimes just be very hard to claw your way back. You go to people and you say, "Hey, what app would be so awesome on the Windows Phone that you would dump your iPhone?" Think about it. Well, it turned out the answer was there was nothing. Okay, and we thought about it. there was no app that was so good if it was exclusively on your Windows Phone that you would dump your iPhone. So that was very hard. And then even the other part was just even you go to a bank, Bank of America at some point discontinued their Windows Phone app, and you're like, "Hey, there are a couple, 1 million, 2 million of your customers on Windows Phone who want to access your bank. Why did you discontinue your app?" But then they're like, "Well, maintaining security of that takes time away from maintaining the iPhone app, and I'd just rather spend my time maintaining the iPhone app and making a better customer experience on the iPhone. I don't want to spend one single engineer and 1 minute of managerial time on Windows Phone. I want to spend it all on the iPhone because that's where most of my customers are." So clawing your way back can be quite difficult, and especially when people have opportunity costs of their time. So when you're at the moment where you're relevant, you have to maintain that relevance. And just people they're busy. They just don't want to bother their time. Generally, of course, bigger is better, cross-site network effects. So what is another, a less well-appreciated aspect of bigger is better is market power in bargaining and negotiation. So just for example, why do Apple and Google take a 30% cut of App Store, but video game console launch titles keep about 100% of revenue? Well, no single app will make a consumer switch phones. Apple and Google are taking 30%, basically partly because they still want to induce the app developers to produce. So they're actually are acting as monopolies, but they're also trying to provide incentives for the whole market. But even an app as big as, say, the Kindle can't negotiate down that 30%. So if you ever wonder why when you buy a Kindle book you have to go to Safari, make the purchase, and send it back to yourself on the phone, that's because if you did an in-app purchase on the Kindle, Apple would take 30%. So even a hit app like Kindle doesn't have bargaining power against the App Store. In the video launch titles, it's even worse because in video launch titles, it's the opposite, because the video games can actually move the consumers. They can move the consumers from Sony to Xbox. So the video games keep 100%, and Xbox keeps 0% for the hit games. So it really matters whether it's not just that, oh, the platform always wins or the content always wins. If the content or the sellers can't move the users, then they're subject to monopoly pricing. If the content can move the users, then they have the power. So why does this matter? Well, if you have big property managers in a particular location, they actually have a fair bit of bargaining power with respect to you. If they took all their listings away from you, that would really hurt you. And so this consolidation, or sort of large professional property managers, they're not as powerful as Halo on the Xbox, but they do have some power, and you have to recognize that in your pricing and negotiations with them. And actually, we see on Expedia, we see that actually consolidation can be motivated specifically by power against the platform. So some of the large hotels merging partly because they want to have more power against Expedia and Google. So you have to realize that the rules that you make might actually incentivize a change in market structure. So an independent, like Hyatt will recruit an independent hotel by saying, hey, you'll pay lower fees to Expedia if you affiliate with us. And similarly, the big property managers might say, hey, list with us, we'll get you direct traffic, you won't have to pay the fee to VRBO, so list with us. So this is something that you have to keep in mind, that your pricing and your policies can actually change the structure of the market. And of course, for the intermediary, you would rather have a fragmented market. You don't want them to consolidate, because then they don't need you as much. And then finally, there's disintermediation. Will the platform get cut out? And of course, that matters whether the customers repeat and what the value creation is relative to the alternative. If people can develop relationships with each other, they're likely to go off platform. I'm also on the board of Rover. We have dog sitters, and that's a big problem there as well. The dog sitter meets the owner, and they may go off platform later. We do some things similar to you, where at Rover, we try to bundle in insurance and other types of things to induce people to do the repeat booking, but it's still a big challenge. And so there, I think one principle is you have to think, well, what value am I creating? The first time you created big value. On the repeat booking, you're not creating as much value. And so it's not clear that you can really take the same fee when you're not creating the value. And indeed, you see that because people don't use you for the second booking. OK, so I'll just briefly mention one of the things I love to spend like an hour on with groups that I talk to in executive education and MBA classes and stuff is the question of Uber versus Lyft and whether that's a monopoly or not. Since we don't have a lot of time today, I'll just, again, give you a little bit of the highlights of the things we discussed. Usually the classes start out thinking that, OK, Uber's got this great valuation. Of course, it's going to be a monopoly, more drivers, more riders, more riders, more drivers. So of course, the valuation is justified. I'll just tell you, every one of my classes ends up at the end like saying, OK, well, monopoly is possible, but actually this kind of looks competitive. So I think it's of course, forget about the self-driving cars, but which is another story. OK, so what are some factors favoring competition of Uber versus Lyft? First of all, substitutes are available with some time delay, so that if somebody was smaller but they undercut, some people are going to be willing to wait another 2 or 3 minutes to get a car in order to get a better price. So you're going to have differentiated consumers, and some of them are willing to wait for a better price, which can help you bootstrap. Users and drivers can use multiple platforms. There's often little unique supply. Of course, the strategy that Uber should follow is to try to create unique supply, to try to get people that are drivers on Uber that aren't drivers on Lyft. But today, they're not doing too much in that direction, and generally, everybody has all the apps on. General purpose tech is available broadly. I think Austin is the great case study for this. People started ride-sharing platforms pretty easily because there's cloud platforms, mapping service, machine learning algorithms, and user interfaces are basically things that you can take off the shelf and just start your business. You don't need to do rocket science to start one. There's free riding on consumer awareness, regulatory, and driver supply. So in some sense, in this case, it was harder for the first mover because you had to induce people to make their job driving Uber. If Lyft comes in second, there's all these guys on the road. All you got to get them to do is turn on the app. There's a bunch of qualified, background-checked, car-inspected people with air conditioners, and you just have to say, hey, turn on another app, and I'll give you a little more business. So it's actually easier for the second mover to come in. And so on. Now, how do you fight that? Well, you can use nonlinear prices. And that's also something that you guys can think about as well. You basically say you're going to get a bonus if you do more than 200 rides with us in a week. And then the driver has an opportunity cost. They don't want to turn on the Lyft app because they would give up their bonus on Uber. So you want to, and who has the advantage in those types of nonlinear prices? The market leader. So if you have most of the demand, say, for vacation rentals already, for high-end vacation rentals, if you gave the suppliers the ability to concentrate their business on you, then they don't want to list on Airbnb to start with, because then they're giving up their bonus or their discount from you. So that's the big firm has the advantage in nonlinear prices, and that's a way to defend. Finally, and I think actually this is pretty definitive, really. There's a bunch of large adjacent platforms with captive consumer bases that won't seed the entire category. So if you had, Uber, say, being the monopoly in transportation, and I'll talk in a minute why they might need to be the monopoly not just in user transportation, but also in delivery and so on, to make sure all their drivers are busy all the time and don't want to use other platforms. But Amazon and other firms aren't going to actually just seed transportation. So if they did get to be a monopoly, there are people who would throw billions of dollars at breaking that up. Factors favoring profitability, economies of scale. Consumers want the fastest ride. So if Uber today offers the fastest ride, consumers are going to tend to go there. They need to have a reason to download the Lyft app, and they may not do that if they're already used to Uber. The algorithms beyond the basics. So better matching, like Uber now does things where they'll cut two matches and rematch. If this guy's driving over here and this guy's driving over here, they'll actually break the links and recreate the links. So these more sophisticated algorithms actually do take a little more R&D, and your Austin ride-sharing apps may not have that kind of technology. Ratings and driver quality, they can get better over time at being better. And then, they also can do this nonlinear pricing. So they can say, hey, we're going to do Uber Eats, we're going to do Uber Delivery, we're going to do Uber People, we're going to give you a bonus for doing all your business with us. And so then the drivers don't want to turn on the Lyft app. And I think that's what they should do as soon as possible if they want to maintain market power. Then there's a question, though, is there enough demand for all these horizontal services like package and food delivery at the right times? Because in the end, like the FedEx delivery system is actually pretty efficient if you don't need something in the next hour. OK. So let me take the last, so that's like kind of general principles with a lot of measurement challenges woven in. Now let me say a few more tactical things about measurement. So first of all, one of my big passions in measurement in market design is the short run versus the long run. And I'm going to end up like talking specifically about search because we made so many mistakes there. So I'm like scarred. I've PTSD from short run measurement. So I preach this wherever I go. But here are some big examples of short run versus long run measurement. So at eBay, they had a couple of businesses that had hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue stream. Listing fees, charging people the listings on eBay, charging people to post pictures on eBay. So in each case, a decision had to be made to eliminate those fees. So with probability 1, if you eliminate the fees, you eliminate $100 or $200 million in revenue. With some uncertainly measured benefits to follow. So it's very hard for companies to make decisions where you lose $100 million with certainty, and your data scientist says probably you'll make between $25 and $175 million back if you account for the uncertainty of your measurement. And so I've had a lot of cases like this. These are very hard business decisions. In each case, eBay did those things. And a lot of the ways they made the revenue back were really pretty indirect. So they made the revenue back to start with by just getting more listings. Having more pictures makes people feel more confident in purchasing more. But another thing that was kind of interesting is when they eliminated the listing fees, the sellers who were selling came back to the site more often, and they bought stuff when they went back to the site. So this was like a very non-obvious indirect effect that like the sellers were also buyers, and just having people show up on the site made people buy things. Those are hard things to predict and forecast and put a number on, but they turned out to be quantitatively important. Changing the search algorithm to emphasize price forces the sellers into more uniform categories. So the better you make sort, the less differentiated the items are, and the more they have to compete on price, because people are able to compare 3 identical. They could be 3 awesome luxury houses, but like if they're all the same, then they have to compete on price. So making sort better really forced the sellers to compete more aggressively, which of course created a lot of welfare for the users and helped them compete as a platform with Amazon. Shipping costs. So making sure that people could see the shipping costs helped force the sellers to lower their shipping costs. But there were also unintended consequences. At some point, when they forced the sellers to pay more attention to shipping costs, a lot of people on eBay started using crappy third-rate shipping companies, and then the packages stopped arriving. So these are again, how do you measure that? How do you anticipate that? Very difficult. So partly there, you do need some theory. You need to say, hey, I'm going to squeeze these guys on shipping. What are they going to do? New shippers will emerge with crappy service that market to eBay sellers. So then they needed to put quality. Once they emphasized price, then they needed to emphasize quality control even more. So you change one thing, and then you have to change something else along the way. Google DoubleClick. Today, about half the ad impressions that are bought on the Google DoubleClick ad exchange are not viewable by a human. So why doesn't DoubleClick stop selling ads that are not viewable by a human? Well, if they did, tomorrow they would lose half their revenue, because half their stuff is not viewable, and they would have to hope that everybody doubled their bids and paid twice as much for the remaining quality. But what if they don't? And in fact, they won't. Not for a year, probably, will they all adjust. And they might just reset the bidding equilibrium at a lower level, and it might take a year or more to get back. So they keep selling garbage and having an inefficient ad exchange because they can't make the proper long-term decision, and so on. Okay, so for your particular market, how do these things play out? Well, what are the problems you're trying to solve? Entry and engagement of new and existing suppliers, ensuring high quality, incentivizing sellers to reduce the friction. Personalization, which is really another way to reduce friction, avoiding disintermediation, competing with Airbnb. And overall, in all of these platforms where both sides have to agree, there's a massive problem with request to book. It's a huge problem on TaskRabbit, a problem on Rover, problem on VRBO, HomeAway, all of these. When both sides have to agree, it's just a really bad user experience, and you just lose a huge amount of your business. So the biggest thing you can do is the easiest thing, the most value-creating thing is to make those conversion rates go up by removing frictions. That means making the sellers behave. That means personalizing, reducing frictions, and helping people find stuff. Because if you know you're creating a huge friction by just waiting 2 hours for the person to respond, or the risk of being rejected, you have to take every other friction out of the system. Lots of trade-offs, the best match versus the best responsiveness. So do I give you the best house or the guy who's going to answer the email? And actually, maybe that even should be personalized, because some buyers may be kind of willing to wait, and other buyers may want to get things done right away. Do you surface new entrants? So this is a problem we have on Rover for sure. We have all these awesome sitters, dog sitters, who we know will deliver 5-star service. Somebody new shows up. They've never sat a dog before. We know they're going to make mistakes the first time. How do we decide to whom to show them and when to show them? And that gets back to this measurement problem of, well, how many do I need? Like, do I have enough dog sitters? Do I really need to encourage new entry of dog sitters? And of course, that varies by market. In some markets, I have plenty of dog sitters, and I don't need to surface the new ones. And in other places, I really need to recruit them and give them business. So that needs to be customized, personalized, and market specific. So there's just a science to that in and of itself. And that's just one aspect of the ranking function. Understanding the health of the supply side broadly. Do I use carrots versus sticks, rules versus incentives? There can be some cases where it's really hard to have a big enough incentive. Like for repeat bookings, I might need to make it free to really capture all of the repeat bookings. But so it's hard to do that completely with prices. But maybe there's other things that you can do that help incentivize that. And which side of the market to favor, of course, varies by market. In terms of knobs and dials, I think this is something that is common to Rover and Bing and you guys. The sort and assignment algorithm is the heart of things. Like giving people the right thing at the right time just creates huge value. It's so darn cumbersome to find what you're looking for. And if you can make that easier and better, that just obviously creates value. One problem we had at Bing was that sometimes people would come in, especially actually the scientist friends of mine. Luckily, Justin was the exception, but because he came in as a scientist. But a lot of the scientists at Microsoft Research would come in, and they were so excited about changing the pricing and changing the mechanism and changing the auction, and they had this and that theory. And I'm like, look, guys, we're showing crappy ads. We just have to stop showing crappy ads. Like, I know it's not that sexy, but until we show the same number of crappy ads as Google, then we're going to be a crappy search engine. So we need to just block and tackle and actually show people ads that are relevant to them and not show them ads that are not relevant to them. But that problem actually is a deep problem. You never finish. You always can get better and better. You can always be more personalized. You can always understand the user better. So that's just the matching part. But of course, everything about the sort affects all of the outcomes, whether you intend it to or not. So every change you make in the sort algorithm redistributes business from one type of seller to another type of seller, which in turn changes all of their incentives. And that's just a huge measurement problem, because we can't run a 4-month test to see how the equilibrium changes every single time we tweak the sorting algorithm. So how do you balance the fact that changing sort changes everything, but I want to improve sort once a week? That was the problem Bing had as well. And sadly, from my perspective there, they just went all the way to, all right, we're just not going to measure the long term, and we're going to do everything short term all the time. And I think that led to a lot of inefficiencies. OK, so we've already talked about a lot of the measurement challenges, the incremental value of the users. And another one is the asymmetry of response times. So generally, the user makes an immediate decision to abandon. So you're basically able to measure the users in a much faster cadence than you can measure the supply side. So that tends to make companies more user-focused. That I can easily and precisely show that I did this or that thing to the users. But what I can't show is that made the sellers spend less time updating their listing on us. That made the seller, over time, list their availability first on Airbnb. That's a very hard thing to measure, and so people tend to focus on the user side too much, as a rule. In practice, what I try to recommend is to map the concepts to measures and really call out what is missing. So one way you can move to more rapid innovation is to say, these types of innovations, they mainly impact the user. They don't have a big impact on the sellers. And so we can measure them very fast, and we can just keep iterating there. But these other types of things might fundamentally change incentives. We need a different measurement scheme. We can't trust the user-level A/B test results, and we need to put more attention on them. So generally, this involves mapping the concepts to measures and calling out what's missing. Say, for this experiment, my measures aren't really missing anything. For this experiment, my measures are actually missing some key components. OK. So let me walk through a little more what some of the problems we had, this case study of search advertising. And we can all feel superior for all the things that Bing did wrong. But I think the fact that this multi-billion-dollar business made these mistakes with hundreds of PhDs working for them also highlight the fact that some of these problems are hard. So the problems they were trying to solve, they also had small business sellers, so that was very hard. We had to get them engaged. We needed them to optimize their campaigns and express their preferences. We needed to maintain user trust and belief in ads for long-term user engagement. We had to constantly improve matching. And something we had that was probably harder than what you have is we had actually advertiser gaming as well. So we had sophisticated online retailers who had algorithms that were optimizing against us. So our sell side was probably more dangerous than yours is. A lot of the trade-offs we faced, we had large versus small advertisers. So companies like eBay and Amazon were customers, and they would lobby and say, we want this, we want that. They would want tools built that only they were sophisticated enough to use, so that they could go through and cherry pick all the good users and then leave the garbage users for the small advertisers. So we had to decide, make business decisions about how important were those small advertisers and how important was it to keep them engaged. And so we had to measure the incremental impact of the small advertisers to make a business decision that says, I know that the CEO of this company, I know the CEO of Expedia just called you up and said, hey, we want this feature to advertise on Bing, and they say they're going to spend, another $50 million, but actually for the health of the marketplace, we can't actually necessarily build that feature. So those were decisions that had to be made, and sometimes it went different ways. We had to trade off user experience versus revenue. And so we also had these problems where, especially once we had the Yahoo business, where Yahoo would be like, oh, we need more money. So then we'd like dial up the ads and change the background color. And so there were all these people, especially the people who worked at Yahoo and then came to Bing. They were experts in figuring out how to manipulate things to get some short-term revenue out. So I'm going to change. If I need another $50 million at Christmas, I just change the background color. And all of these things were long-term value destructing, short-term value enhancing, and people really got good at manipulating those when their superiors told them they had to. But this was not, nobody liked this. People didn't feel fulfilled in their jobs. They felt like they were cheating. And they also, once they found those knobs, it was very tempting not to use them in other times. So partly this gets like this opioid analogy, like you get addicted to your tricks. And so I think it's very important to balance, like always remembering that this, here's something that I can get a few bucks today, but it's not sustainable revenue. Here's something that it's going to have to work a lot harder to actually make a better ranking algorithm, but that's real value that's going to last forever. Okay. So another type of challenge I had, which I'm sure you also face, is that different people wanted different things out of the data. So I put up here this example, one metric versus multiple metrics. So I had one head of product that for like 9 months we were on this mission to have one metric to optimize the ad platform. I spent a month trying to argue against this. Eventually I gave up, and we spent the whole next 8 months coming up with the one metric. Then actually people got fired all the time, so he got fired, and the next person didn't want that anymore. The problem with the one metric is that, like, one metric for advertisers and sellers and consumers and publishers, it was just confusing. You would look at the number, but then the first question you would ask is, well, did that come from advertisers or did that come from users? So it was just, even though it was one number, it wasn't a simple number. It was easier to talk about 3 numbers than to talk about 1 numbers. And he just had it in his head that 1 number was the way you managed a business. He said if there's 3 constituents, you cannot have less than 3 numbers. It's harder rather than easier. Of course, sometimes you had to aggregate it up to 1 number, but you couldn't have an intelligent conversation without looking at the 3 numbers. We also had to think about, like, measures for different purposes. So measures for A/B testing, you knew that you were doing short-term tests, and so the measures might need to be adjusted to account for short-term versus long-term. Versus other numbers for watching how your business grows over 3 years, that's a different set of numbers. So basically, like, we had a big project where we went through and said, here are all the constituents, here are all the metrics, and then here's the versions of the metrics for different purposes and different audiences. And of course, okay, that manager likes to keep it simple, so let's give them a not quite as good metric that's easy to explain, while this manager can understand complexity, so we'll give them the best metric. And it was really hard. And of course, when the managers changed, then we'd have to go from simple to complex and complex to simple to make everybody happy. The thing that kept us from having heads exploding was partly that we actually, we had the concepts. So we were everybody who was doing this was clear on the concepts, and then we could have different versions of measuring the concepts for different audiences. Finally, as I mentioned, one of the big inefficiencies was that we did primarily short-term user-level experiments, basically because it was very difficult to measure the advertiser responses. The typical time for the advertisers to respond was between 2 and 6 months. And so that was just so slow, and people never wanted to wait for it. It was also actually very difficult to do it well. So that led to systematic biases towards initiatives that are good in the short term and bad in the long term. In particular, if I take an auto insurance ad and show it on a consumer looking for toothpaste, I make money. I make $30 for each accidental click. So that's real money that I'm making. If I want to take the auto insurance ad off of the toothpaste query, I'm going to lose real money, and I'm only going to make it back when the auto insurance advertiser realizes that those ads are more valuable and pays more for them, which may take months. So we constantly had to fight to make the ad quality better because of this short-term, long-term bias. Another very similar thing was there was always an incentive to raise the prices for the advertisers because, again, it would take them a while to respond. So what are some of the fixes we used? Well, we used offline simulation with crude response models. So I would do things like say, OK, a crude response model is that half the advertisers pay for quality and reduce their bids if we reduce the quality. I would say things like, we would throw, in the A/B testing platform, we would throw away revenue from quick back clicks. So if somebody clicked on an ad and came right back, we actually booked the money, but we wouldn't count it when evaluating the A/B test because we said that's not sustainable revenue. That's not a good signal for what will happen in the future. Also, to deal with the complexity, we did a lot of stuff with mix adjustments. So we said, let's break up the market. And so one way you could make more money is you could put more ads on auto insurance queries and less ads on toothpaste queries. So let's do mix adjustment, and let's see how the changes are performing segment by segment. People didn't want 25 numbers for 25 segments. But if we looked at what happens within a segment and then used mix adjustment, we could get it back to that glorious one number that people could absorb in a meeting. We tried to analyze heterogeneous treatment effects, and that's actually some of my statistical academic work is on that, where we basically wanted to say, let's evaluate the A/B test and let's use the data to say who is helped and who is hurt. That can also give you insight about, am I cheating somehow? Like if all the money is coming from auto insurance advertisers, I might get suspicious that I'm somehow exploiting them. Harder fixes, doing a small number of long-term studies to relate short-term metrics to long-term outcomes. I also have some statistical research on this. But actually, the biggest problems aren't statistics. It's just practical. Like what short-term metrics are actually stable and representative of long-term outcomes. One of the ways I do that in practice is to say, let's break up different types of experiments. For this type of experiment, this metric represents the long term. For this type of experiment, this other metric represents the long term. Because you can't, it's just impossible to find one measure that represents the long term across all the different things you can change. We did advertiser and market level experiments. We also built models, like actual models of individual behavior, like large-scale Bayesian models, where we had a model for every advertiser. I used those in research. Those were pretty hard to use in practice. So that was something that I think sometimes researchers get very excited about, and I think they can be really useful, but it's just very hard to make them scale and make them realistic. Overall, I think there's big trade-offs in the approaches. You have to make sure your hammer fits the nail and optimize for the right objective. Sometimes use simple approaches that don't take you in the totally wrong direction. Like I had lots of more complicated fixes, but just like throwing away the revenue from quick back clicks in the A/B testing platform was probably the most impactful thing that I did. And I had some fancy statistical model, which would have been better, and I showed it was better. And anytime you want, I'll pull out the slides and show you how much better it was. But I had to part with it when the managers felt like the simpler thing was going to be easier for everyone to understand. Finding heuristics that work for large-scale optimization. So finding the heuristic that gets you 90% of the way there, and then over time you can improve it. Generally, developing more complex approaches with the understanding of the limitations, scale, realism, assumptions, robustness, and so on. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, different audiences have different tastes, so you need to understand who you're working for. For some people, if they can't understand the black box, they'll never trust the results. For other people, they don't care what's in the black box. They just want you to demonstrate the output. And so understanding who you're dealing with can change your approach. And that's something I had to learn to be very flexible when speaking to, because I was speaking to boards, I was speaking to corporate strategy, I was speaking to people making $35 billion offers, and I was also speaking to PhD machine learning people who wanted to build super complicated black boxes. And we had to figure out how to make all of those work and be adaptable. OK, so I'll stop there. And I think Justin and I were going to have a little bit of a conversation.
It was an awesome intro.
I almost wanted to leave because, it couldn't really get better from the intro.
Intro. Okay. We got 2 of those chairs, or
Yes,
just
we
okay. Okay. So first of all, holy shit, that was a great talk, man. Let's give her a round of applause. Wow, Susan, I gotta say, you are way better at giving talks than I am. I was sitting over there, I was like, I think I'm pretty good at this, but I always have that reaction. I think I'm pretty good at this thing I do, but you're better. So, wow, humbled. The chair. Wow, I've seen people do this little sit thing. Wow, this feels weird, right?
You need to go to higher-end conferences.
I need to get invited to higher-end conferences. I don't get all the. You start funneling some of your rejects to me. Say, I've CC'd Justin Rao. He goes to my reject list.
Well, so this is what you do when you get you get CEOs. You sit on stage and then you ask a generic question, and I give a generic answer.
Okay, sure, I got you ready. What skills are MBAs learning today that they weren't learning 10 years ago?
Seriously? Okay,
Seriously.
very good. That was an example of a fluffy question. I just want to make sure.
I had some softballs here, and then that I'll get.
Yeah.
We got some from earlier, then we'll go to the mics. But
yeah, so one of the things I'm actually passionate about at Stanford is trying to prepare our students for the new world. And so, you guys see the changes here. I saw the changes at Microsoft. There were product managers who had been trained in a previous era. And then I felt like, they would get just out-muscled by the engineers and the developers. But the engineers and developers were not always right. And so I felt like, the business people brought the thinking to the table, all the stuff I was talking about today. In some sense, I wouldn't be talking about it if the engineers had got it right. I wouldn't be passionate about these issues. I would just say, oh, this is easy. The engineers get it right. The engineers get short-term versus long-term. The engineers understand why it's a good idea to cut listing fees and throw away $100 million in photo fees. So great, nothing to talk about. But of course, these problems are all hard, and they're hard because they're business problems. And so I feel like the MBAs need to first really develop their muscle in analytical thinking so that they can bring that to the table. And then second, they need to get comfortable enough with data that they aren't intimidated by the people that are. Because again, the people that are comfortable with data are not always right, especially like if you take someone out of, say, a master's program or a PhD program in computer science at Stanford, they might have spent 4 years tuning neural nets. Because they heard that guy from Carnegie Mellon got a 7-figure job offer for neural nets. It's true. So they're like, why? Like, I'm going to get really good at tuning that neural net, and the 7 figures is mine too. But tuning a neural net does not help prepare you to make business decisions at all. Zero. Nothing about tuning the neural net prepares you for business decisions. And so if you're going to have those folks, then you also need folks who can think about it and think about it conceptually. So I think, generally, and when we think about executive education or sort of retraining, I think you want to take the people who didn't have the technical background, give them enough confidence that they can contribute ideas and analytics, and then you want to take the people who have this awesome technical skills and bring some of the business context. But it's hard for one person to be good at all of that. Of course you are. But it's very hard for one person to be good at all of that. And so we need to be able to have people talk to each other as the first step. But if my MBAs don't leave Stanford with the ability to collaborate with a data science team and an engineering team, I think they're going to be useless in the future. They're not, why would you enter the labor market at age 27 or 28 without the ability to take part in this transformation? And a bunch of people won't be. And so if you can be, you're going to be you're going to be part of the growth industry. You're going to be the people that everybody's bidding over.
Well, there you go. Softball question, real talk answer.
So this is why it was worthwhile to spend 40 hours on homework. By the way, that's more homework than I give my PhDs for a quarter-long class, as a
you're not helping my popularity question.
I give them see, I'm worried about office hours and people emailing me, so I give them prepackaged R scripts so that they don't have syntax errors, so I don't get like 50 emails in the middle of the night.
That was not done. Yeah, we should have briefed a little bit before we started
Well,
talking.
my incentives are to minimize my work. You actually want people to learn this stuff. So.
That's right. Luckily, I had a really big team to do office hours and help me out. People can attest that I personally wasn't helping very much, but let's not focus on that. Okay, switching gears. You talked today a bit about markets tipping and why they might tip and why they won't. In traditional online travel agents, we sort of see two big players worldwide in Europe and the United States, and 3 or 4 if you go to Asia. But focusing on North America, it seems that Booking.com and the Expedia brand of families is at a sort of standstill where both have meaningful market share, are operating at positive margins, and it's been that case with no real shift for about 7 years. What do you think drives the fact that that can happen there? Would that happen in alternative accommodations, or is that maybe a sort of historical coincidence, or that's non-standard in your mind?
I think 2 is a very common number.
Yeah.
1 is a very common number, and 2 is a very common number, and 3 is a slightly less common number for marketplaces and platforms. Of course, in e-commerce, there's like a long fringe. But so, the monopolies can happen, and of course, Google is a monopoly in search in many parts of the world. We don't have time for it all today, but there's a bunch of forces that make that market more tippy than others. One of the easier to understand ones is just that the algorithms can always get better. So the search problem is just so hard that if you have 5 billion queries a month, that's not as good as having 10 billion, because it's just so hard to get the right answer. In something more simple like travel search, it's actually technically not as hard to get the right answer. But on the other hand, we've seen these economies of scale in attracting this very fragmented supply. So I think one reason for the consolidation is just that, it's very hard for everybody to go out and get that supply. And what Expedia has done is they've bought Orbitz and so on, is that they've, the part where you attract the supply side is a common platform. And that's the part that's really hard. And so if you're small, you can't get the suppliers to pay attention to you. So why it's concentrated is a lot about attracting the supply side. It's also about the advertising markets and so on. Like it's easier to advertise if you have full content. So I can run a major TV campaign if I'm sure that I can serve every single person who sees my TV commercial. If I only have part of the market, it's harder to buy that marketing. When I think about 2 versus 1, yeah, it could go to 1.
Yeah.
It's possible. It's possible it can stay at 2. And that partly depends on how aggressive people want to be, and if Booking decided to cut all of their fees and be really aggressive, they're ahead. It's possible that they could take even more market share, but that may not be the profit maximizing thing for them to do.
Yep.
Another aspect is that when you go from 2 to 1, a lot of the players are very concerned about that.
Yep.
So if you were seeing things start to get more asymmetric, then at least big suppliers would tend to try to want to favor the dying firm, because they can see that the dying firm is essential to keeping their prices low in the long term. Yeah,
absolutely. In that same vein, I'll just sort of throw a wild card at you. I love the Uber Lyft walkthrough. I recently worked for a company where a huge amount of their valuation was in the cloud computing space. And I was asked by the CEO and the CFO what I thought on whether there'll be margins in this business ever. Because there weren't at present, and they're not at present. Amazon declares they have something like 15% gross margin, but that net margin's probably 0. What do you think about cloud computing? Do you think, on the one hand, it's going to be something like monopoly, or do you think the technological advances where you have multi-cloud strategies and so forth are just going to eat into that, and it's never going to get there, and these valuations that Amazon and Microsoft have about that future profitability are off the mark?
Yeah, so I worked on cloud computing before. We didn't overlap too much in our cloud computing, a little bit, but in the very early days, it was actually very controversial. So Microsoft was sitting on like a $6 to $8 billion revenue stream in their server and tools division. Steve Ballmer put Satya Nadella into that spot, and he had to immediately decide to basically stop serving the $6 to $8 billion revenue stream and put all of the developers into investing in cloud computing. a business where they had no customers. All the CIOs told them they never wanted the product. And there was a pretty strong belief, there was at least a logical argument, that it might never have any margins.
Yeah.
Okay, so like you have this fat, huge margin business, and you're going to blow it up for something that may never have profits. That was a really tough decision. Steve made a lot of mistakes, but putting Satya in and supporting him through that transition was probably one of the gutsiest things I've ever seen in a business. It's unappreciated. So, I think that in the end, I think it will not be one.
Yeah.
Because companies like Expedia, banks, in Australia, they won't let any more banks go on to AWS because it's a countrywide risk to have your entire financial infrastructure on AWS.
Yeah.
So ultimately, everybody understands we need at least 2 providers. And again, there will be people that prop up, whether it's regulators or customers, that want dual sourcing. But it might be very hard for the second place firm to make any money, especially on the sort of core stuff. Like if Amazon is 20% cheaper than Microsoft, then roughly the equilibrium is that Microsoft charges like 5% less than their cost as a way to acquire customers, and Amazon charges 15% more than their cost.
Yep.
Amazon makes margins, Microsoft loses, and then Microsoft hopes to make it up on the extra services they offer, and Amazon actually does. So that's kind of what an asymmetric duopoly looks like,
Yeah.
I think. Does that mean Microsoft should exit? No, because if they exit, they're dead. And they,
Yeah, it's not on the table.
And then they can hope that they grow big enough to have similar cost structure to Amazon, and then they can both make money on the extra services. But I guess the bigger picture, I think, for HomeAway is that being a disadvantaged platform competitor really sucks, because your competitor can just create more value. They create it for free, basically, just by being bigger.
Yep.
And so then when you're competing with someone who can just intrinsically have a better product, then you have to subsidize people to use your product, and that's expensive.
Bing, you talked about Bing's sort of pitfalls early. Bing is an example of making it. That is to say, if you believe what Microsoft's disclosing now, it's line item profitable. In terms of its...
Yes, we got there like the month before I left,
Yeah.
so I was like, all right, I can quit now.
In terms of its sort of core relevancy judgments and so forth, it's at near parity to Google, modulo the fact that there's just a intrinsic disadvantage they have. When you were there, did you think that would happen? Or were you, in your heart, were you thinking, man, we're sort of like, we're fighting, and we should just kind of just pay Google to serve Windows searches and walk from information retrieval and
yeah, well, just like the big question they asked you and at some point asked me as well, is like, can cloud computing ever be profitable? My first meeting, Steve Ballmer invites me, this little Harvard professor, to come to Redmond and says, all right,
Harvard professor.
I get
bullshit.
I get in this room with like the 10 executives I've never met before, and he basically like draws arrows on the board for half an hour, and then says, okay, Susan, will there ever be 2 players in search? And that was really the question that we grappled with for a couple of years. But I think that basically in search, you need to have enough. It's basically an ad-funded media business in the end of the day. And if you can get enough users to cover your fixed costs, you can be profitable. So, of course, if MSN had been better, if Microsoft had a mobile platform, if they hadn't let their browser deteriorate, they actually had a lot of sources of free traffic. And if they can get that sort of free traffic, they just need to get enough of it to sell ads on it to cover the fixed costs. So there's sort of free traffic you get because you kind of steer it to yourself, just like Android does to Google search. Then there's traffic you pay for, like Microsoft bought Yahoo. And there, my recommendation from the first day was the only way you will ever be profitable is if you get to 25% roughly. If you just do some back of the envelope, you could see that 20 to 25% of the US market to be profitable. And the only way to get there was get a Yahoo search business. So that was basically the strategy from day one. You would have to give away all the revenue to get Yahoo search business. Yeah. But then once you were 30% of the market, you could make profit on the part that you were getting for free, because at that point, you would have enough users to attract advertisers. You would have good enough algorithms to create a good experience. So the users you got for free wouldn't run away, and the advertisers would engage in you enough to make money. So that was basically like really the strategy from the first month.
Yeah.
And then the question was, could we implement it? And then along the way, there was all this just hard work to like say, we had a search engine, but it had bad relevance. We had crappy ads. We weren't optimizing anything. We didn't know how to measure. We didn't know how to test. We had no dashboards. We had no nothing. And so it was going to be a long, hard, tough slog to make an awesome search engine.
Yeah.
But if we executed and could just copy Google and get 25% of the PC market, we could be profitable.
And you were right. Okay, I have one more from the preceded questions, and we'll open up the mics.
Okay, we burned like $15 billion on the way.
There were some write-downs. You were generally right. Okay, one more. I think this will be a fun one. Recently in the news, we read about Etsy firing about 20% of their workforce, and they have activist investors that are looking to CEO step down, and it's pretty tumultuous over there in Brooklyn. Etsy's a marketplace platform you didn't talk about today that seems to be at a make or break point. And if you walked into their boardroom today, what would you say to pull them out of what seems to be kind of a dire situation in terms of where they're at?
Whoa.
Yeah.
That's harder than coding 40 hours in art. Let's see. Well, I mean, I think, fundamentally, their business is a good business. I think there's sort of two issues. One is, like, can it grow? So everybody wants their businesses to grow. Is there, like, a medium-sized, nice business that when you try to make it something that it's not, fails?
Yeah.
That's the first thing. But second, also, is just how do you optimize this business? And so I'm not a huge expert on Etsy, but I think that search is pretty clunky.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of frictions. They also have externalities to manage, like that people are copying each other's stuff and so on. So they actually have a lot of problems that could be solved by better marketplace management, better algorithms, and so on. And so it may be that they were a little bit too hands-off.
Yep.
Marketplaces, in the end, like you can't be a completely hands-off thing. They don't manage themselves. There are externalities left, right, and center, and you need rules and algorithms and incentives to make them function well.
Okay, well, I'll invite people to the mics now. So if your question didn't get asked from the pre-seed, please, scurry up to the mics and fire away. As you can see, you can basically ask her whatever you want. You'll get a straight answer. All right, here we go. Kun.
Hey, Kun, data scientist. So in your talk, you talk about the measurement short-term versus long-term. We all know the measurement for long-term is challenging. But as a data scientist, by training, optimization, stochastic system, we need certain kind of object function to help us, support us to make those decisions on the uncertainty. So in your opinion, what are those challenges to factor in those long-term metrics into the consideration now to make that decision may impact for 1 year or 2 years?
Yep. So I think probably the mistakes that I made early on, well, I mean, first of all, when I first got to Bing, like it was just an emergency. Like we had just 3 times as many ads as Google, and like most of them were just completely irrelevant. Like you could buy Susan Athey on eBay. It was just a big mess. I think that in the beginning, though, and partly maybe this was the right place to go in the beginning, but we tried for like one-size-fits-all approaches. Like I wanted to fix measurement for everything. Then I think over time, as you mature and you have some of those quicker fixes in there, it requires a more segmented approach. So you can have like one objective function that you optimize, but then you recognize that, say, certain types of experiments, like pricing changes and so on, don't fit into the standard toolbox. So it's like you have 2 tracks or 3 tracks, for things that are long-term user or things that are long-term seller, and then things that are kind of incremental optimization. And if you can identify the things that are just incremental optimization, then you can use like a simpler, higher fidelity, more accurate, lower variance objective function and optimize against it. So I think of it as kind of like a little bit of triage of understanding when you need to get harder. And then I think also, in some cases, if there's something that's super important but super hard to measure, you can put in proxies or placeholders or weights that just force you to not do the wrong thing. And then a final thing is actually just rules. One of the things I felt at Bing with moderate success is just all right, we have an auction, and there's certain rules of the auction we just don't break. And there's certain types of pricing things you just don't do. And then I don't have to worry about my metrics picking those up. So there's a little bit of leadership as well. All right, here's some pools where we know we can play. Here's some pools we know are very dangerous. It's a similar kind of form of triage.
Great. Dylan?
Next question, please.
No
Next
follow-ups.
question, please.
Sorry.
So I actually think you might have just answered it, but I was going to hone in a little bit on something you said earlier about heuristics versus the more complex solution, and just, so Dylan, I'm the engineering lead for the ranking team, and so that we've migrated away from that heuristic to kind of fully invested in ranking models, machine learning models. I'm wondering if there's, do you see that as a transition that you make totally away from one into the other, or is there kind of more these smaller iterative cycles where you might be testing smaller ideas, bootstrapping those ideas with the heuristic, and then driving towards that bigger, more complex model?
Great question.
Yeah. So first of all, in general, when I say using heuristics, sometimes that can be on the metrics and measurement side. Of course, any great ranking thing is going to use machine learning, fully. So I don't want to be misunderstood at all as saying that, there could be anything other than full-blown machine learning in a state-of-the-art system. But it's also the case that, sometimes you can get there step by step. And so, there can be, if you're building a very complex predictive model, well, it may be that 2 or 3 features get 80% of the accuracy, and that you could fine-tune the thresholds, but you could sort of use a heuristic to test that idea. So you can prototype a feature using heuristics, and then if you see that it works, that's when you invest in sort of the full-blown thing. And so a lot of the work that maybe also, when I was doing stuff at Bing, there was, of course, engineering teams who were doing all the regular course of business. I was usually thinking about new things and things that were missing, and maybe things that were controversial. So there was a lot of benefit to, I would imagine, what would I do if I had 3 PhD students in 2 years? And then I would figure out what's the very simple version of that where I can do a proof of concept or test. And then sometimes, actually, there were memory constraints, there were system performance constraints, and you would leave it there. And then, so you would kind of build up from there.
Awesome. Let's go over to Chris.
Thanks. Kind of following up on the short-term versus long-term, conversion is a big focus for all of our A/B testing, but I was curious if you had examples of some of the kind of maybe secondary effect short-term metrics that you use to look at long-term. I could think of maybe supply NPS and the lifetime value of supply, things like that, but I was curious if you had examples.
Yeah, so I think that it's easier to do this on the user side. So you can think about lots of measures of the user's experience on the platform and engagement that could be, predictive of longer-term engagement. And there, the big challenge is that there's, if you start counting clicks or dwell time or something, if you make a major change to your user interface, you'll change the meaning of those metrics. So that's partly what I meant by segmenting. If you're doing regular course of business back-end optimization that doesn't change the user interface, then everything about the time people spend on the platform and how they engage can be predictive of the long term. But you can't use that when you change the whole user interface, because the meaning of a click and the meaning of a dwell as a predictive feature can change. I think on the supplier side, again, there's all the measures of engagement and whether they're keeping their calendar current, and measures of whether they're keeping their supply up to date with you and so on, that again can be proxies. But basically, my husband works a day a week at Amazon, and I had counted this at Bing. He's a professor also. He came home and said, we have to work on surrogates. And so he wrote this paper, and pretty much every tech firm I talk to, they want to talk about this question, because it seems like, one of it's like the holy grail. If I could have a good short-term metric, that's what we all want. But it's hard. And so I think my latest on that is just break the problem down, because trying to do it one size fits all, just you get an empty set. Like, there is no metric that's completely stable against all experiments. So breaking it out by the type of experiment and the type of thing and doing those kind of blocking and tackling may be the only way to really make it work effectively.
That's great. Let's go to Aditya.
I have a question about behavioral economics and its role in marketplaces. We're dealing in a place where we're asking people to make decisions and investments into our platform, and people kind of don't always behave rationally. And so how should we think in terms of our experiment design and our metrics to incorporate irrational, user behavior?
Yeah, that was the worst part in search, because I would say things like, you can't put an auto insurance ad on a toothpaste query that's not sustainable revenue. And then people would say, prove it to me, Susan. And then it turned out like there was a bunch of people where you could take their ad and put it on a toothpaste query, and they wouldn't do anything for 6 months. So what do you do with that? Right? Here's a bunch of people, and I can screw them over. I can exploit them. I can suck money out of them, and I just watch them for 6 months, and they don't pay attention, and they just let you take their money. That's the version of the behavioral consumer as well. So, I don't know that I ever got a perfect answer to that. I think there's some extent to which, even if they let you screw them over for 6 months, like eventually they'll walk away. Also, that if you manage for that, you'll divert your scarce resources to figuring out how to exploit people, because that's always cheaper and easier and faster than making better ranking functions that have already been improved 5 times. So, I think there's a bunch of reasons as a business that you decide sort of not to exploit people. But it's hard when the numbers don't fully agree with you. And then I think the second part of that is that also people who don't behave rationally are harder to predict and forecast and so on. Because you say, oh, well, I can take this fee out of there and I could put it over here. It'll be simpler. It won't matter. It'll all be good, except for like the users hate the fee over there and they don't notice the fee over here. So it becomes harder to manage your business in the presence of behavioral consumers. And so I think they're like having like sort of 2 sets of things. First of all, like some idea that ultimately exploitation comes back to bite you in the butt, even if it's not in 5 or 6 months. And then second, really building an understanding of the people. Like, what do they want? What are the mistakes they're making? And incorporating that. So and I know that's not maybe very helpful.
That was helpful.
Let's
go right here.
Hi, I'm Katie Slesser on the Traveler product team. You mentioned being able to change the color behind an advertisement at Christmas time for a short-term gain. There's definitely seasonality in travel, and so I'm curious your take on how we should be using that when thinking through our A/B testing strategy in terms of finding the ultimate long-term value. Is it better to take riskier, bigger tests during our high traffic season outside of just sheer numbers and getting more data and results faster, or better to play it safe in down seasons or no time like the present?
That's a great question. So actually at Bing we had a lockdown for the holiday season. And actually one of my friends at Facebook who used to work at Microsoft and now works at Amazon, that's the 7-figure machine learning guys, at Facebook during this, he was trying to get this thing released for the Super Bowl one year. And he was doing a click prediction, and at some point he forgot to divide by 100 at the very end, or multiply by 100. And so for like an hour and a half of the Super Bowl, there were no ads on Facebook. Because he shipped this 5 minutes before the Super Bowl. So obviously there's some risks like that. But I think actually maybe another way to think about that question is that a holy grail would be that all of your systems and algorithms are optimized to the local market conditions. So that, because you have imbalance between December and September, but you also have imbalance across all of your different markets and all of these different times. And so ultimately, you would want to understand supply and demand algorithmically with protections for the consumer experience and consistency, and optimize, market by market so that you wouldn't really need to do Christmas as the only way that you can learn about Christmas-like conditions, because you would understand that Christmas-like conditions occur in these other markets at these other times.
Awesome.
Okay, interrupt for a second. So let's start something. We either go into rapid fire Q&A because Susan's got a hard stop, or we shorten the number of questions. So let's try with the shorter, more concise questions, please.
And I'll try shorter answers.
Charlie.
Hey, Susan. Charlie here. I liked your example from eBay about squeezing suppliers to change their behavior and, in turn, please the customers for their long-term gain. I feel like HomeAway is at that inflection point right now, and it's kind of been difficult for us to determine how much attrition is enough or too much to pay for that marketplace gain. So do you have any advice or anecdotes about how that played out at eBay and what we should look for?
Yeah, I think in some ways eBay's had an easier problem because they had to give up big short-term revenue and upset their seller base, but it was just an imperative to compete with Amazon. I actually think your problem is harder because on the one hand, your consumers expect more. On the other hand, if you lose your unique supply versus Airbnb, you're dead. Like, you won't come back from that. So you actually have to make both sides of the market happy right now, and that's not easy. And that often means squeezing in the middle. So I guess in some sense, I think of HomeAway as a little bit more like a startup business. I mean, you're in like 2.0. You're starting your new business model. You have this huge competitor. So, you know, often early on, when you're trying to grow or defend, often the middle does get squeezed when you're trying to make both groups happy. Of course, in the long term, if you can dominate, say, the higher end part of the market, there will be margins there. But right now, I think all of that's at risk. And so it's actually pretty tricky. So I would think about like the behavior and the experience. Yes, you have to have instant book. You have to have fast response times or you die. But you know, trying to also at the same time extract lots of surplus out of people who are on the margin of working with Airbnb is also very dangerous. So figuring out who are the suppliers who you're at risk of losing and which markets you're actually have a pretty competitive situation. And then maybe you have to take a hit on the bottom line in those markets.
Susan, I think we'd love you to say that to the Expedia board next time you're there. Lynn?
I do.
Hi, Susan. So we're a DoubleClick customer, and we spend a lot of money with Google and Facebook. So my question is from a marketplace perspective, as a company that has a pretty healthy supply position, and we made a lot of progress in terms of removing friction for customer shopping as well as supply onboarding. And we are just taking baby steps towards that segmented community experience that really speaks to individual customers. So in that position that we're in, do you think that it's better to, or do you have a perspective or maybe a framework to guide us in our thinking? Is it better to spend our money, acquisition money, in kind of bringing a lot of traffic to kind of strengthen the marketplace transaction volume, et cetera? Or is it better to spend that money product development, targeting on spearfishing more to have higher quality traffic that converts better?
That's a great question. I think, yeah. So I don't have all the information to fully answer that, but just a few thoughts. I think, first of all, like you want to get yourself in a position where you can do, like you have a brand, that you can market the brand, that you're not losing the brand game against Airbnb, and I think that's an emergency in some sense. But then the other thing is that when the people come, you better have the stuff for them. And you want to think about also, what is it exactly that I'm marketing? And so if it's the case that we have the flywheel perfected at the high end, then marketing to the high end and delivering an amazing and superior experience once the person comes, which requires some product as well. So I think about, like, I don't know the exact scoping of how you make that work, but basically I think of this as all needs to be coherent. You're wasting your brand dollars if you advertise the wrong brand or if you advertise the wrong thing. Then you want to figure out what it is you're selling and then get the whole flywheel going with product and advertising. And so whether the implementation of that is targeted marketing or mass media marketing, I think depends on what exactly it is you're marketing.
Awesome. William?
Hi, William Keck, Product Manager on Revenue Management. I'm wondering if you have a concern about an academic brain drain. For example, you have Uber, who single-handedly hired some of the most notable professors like Garrett Van Ryzen, Robert Phillips, and even stole the entire team from Carnegie Mellon that was known for what they were doing. So those departments are now much lighter than they used to be. How do we continue to educate the next generation when professors always did kind of consulting, but never leaving institutions. And I think we're kind of in a new age of that. Is there any fear of that?
Yeah, people worry about that. I guess I'm a little less worried because I think that it's sort of temporary, and that right now there's so much basic R&D. Microsoft needed me for Bing in the first 4 years because they were inventing a new business, and there was lots and lots and lots of conceptual issues. At some point,
then I took over.
Then Justin took over, right? But at some point, it becomes more routine, and so you can have the students and not the professors. And I think with the self-driving cars and stuff like that, they're laying the conceptual framework right now. But then there will be a long period of incremental innovation. And the other thing is people come back. Like and that was what I did. People thought I would never go back. But I was so excited to go back because I saw all these problems. I've written 15 statistics papers in the last 2 to 3 years because I had all of these problems. And every single paper, I knew that like 100 people would use it tomorrow if I just wrote the paper. So I think that it can feed back. And at Stanford, I'm sending students in, and then they're coming back. So, and at the moment, like academia is pretty dull without industry. Like parts of economics were getting incredibly dull. We're studying demand elasticity of ketchup. Like, why not we go design markets? So I think that that's and in computer science, like the computer science would be nothing if it wasn't taking the industry problems.
Awesome, Ben.
Hi, Ben. Wow, and my head's spinning. Thank you for being here. I have so many questions, but I narrowed down on one. Earlier, you talked about focusing on investment to maximize total surplus, which makes total sense from the supply side. But then you said find the buyers who maximize total surplus. And that left me thinking, what? So I wanted to ask, what did you mean by find the buyers that maximize?
Oh, I'm sorry. Maybe I didn't speak exactly precisely. But so basically, so you want to think about maximizing total surplus, and then think about how and whom to charge in a way that doesn't hurt the transaction volume. So, for example, like on TaskRabbit, or a lot in many cities on Uber, like you have this infinite supply of people who have a little bit of spare time. And so in some sense, like squeezing them doesn't hurt your marketplace, because if a few people quit and stop driving or unpacking boxes or whatever, you still have plenty. So you're kind of demand constrained, not supply constrained. And so the way to grow the market is to squeeze the supply and expand demand. But in other markets like yours, where you really have to keep both sides actively managed, it's more complex. And then you need to look at, okay, well, here's some people who are doing $600,000 a year in revenue for us, and they're not going anywhere. We have the customers, so we can charge them in one way. Here are some other people who are more at the margin of going off platform, maybe because they have a great e-commerce platform or whatever, and we have to find other ways to charge them. At the same time, of course, you have to have uniform policies. So a lot of times what happens is you have uniform policies, but then you're doing like deals on the back end to deal with people who don't have the incentive to come. So broadly, that's what makes it such a hard problem. You have so many dimensions. What's the pricing structure? What's the pricing level? What are the deals that I cut? What are the quantity discounts? And it matters. And so the principles around that are then when you're choosing among all of these alternatives, I want to take my money from people for whom they're not going to leave when I do it.
Awesome. Right here.
Hey, my name is Amelia Boudin. I'm a product manager on the e-commerce team. I was wondering, on a much more personal note, if your in-depth knowledge of marketplaces has changed your own behavior as you transact.
Oh, great question.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think I'm pretty attentive to what the incentives are. So, for example, my husband took my kids to see the eclipse in Oregon, and they decided at the last minute that the hotel they had was going to be too trafficky, like there was going to be too many people, so they needed to get a new place. So they got an Airbnb for a large price. And then I was saying, well, all of these people are one-time Airbnb renters. They will never rent their house or apartment on Airbnb ever again. So we're really at risk that this person could renege because they don't care about their Airbnb reputation, and they could list, like, so that he got it for $600, but now the going price is $2,000. Why wouldn't he list it on HomeAway for $2,000 and just renege? So, understanding that, we have all these incentives, but they only work if you care about engagement in the platform, made me, he kept a backup hotel reservation just in case. And then I also said, well, you need to email them, make a personal connection, tell them the kids are coming so they all feel too guilty. But really, you're relying on human nature because these people could have made another $1,000, and they probably aren't rich people.
Last question, Scott Boudreau.
Hi, I'm Scott, former being as well. I feel your pain, so thanks for sharing. Just how disruptive do you think voice interfaces are going to be on the search market, like Google Home, Amazon Echo? What do you see there?
Yes, I used to say how sad it was that Microsoft missed mobile. Now I'm very sad that the Amazon Echo isn't a Cortana device from Microsoft's perspective. So I think it does seem to be at least temporarily disruptive, and I think also people do see the lessons of search. Like basically everybody but Google pays the Google tax. Expedia pays the Google tax, Amazon pays the Google tax. So there's a lot of very well-funded groups that don't want to see Google happen again. I think that for a company like Expedia, it's great because if there's multiple platforms, then you're not squeezed by Google the way that you were before. So I think at least temporarily it will be a great benefit to competition and search. And also just anytime the only way to really displace Google is to change the form factor and change the game in some way. Mobile was the one chance. And now this is another one.
Okay, one more. I didn't see Robert behind the speaker tower. Robert, you're the last. Is that correct? And then Anna, you're going to announce the break. Okay, you're looking at me. Thumbs up. Robert.
Sure. With the acquisition of HomeAway by Expedia and now over a year's worth of work, Expedia is our largest property manager in terms of listing volumes. I'm interested in your thoughts about the economics gains and pitfalls of merging kind of the hotel experience with the vacation rental experience.
Yeah, that's very deep, and you guys know a lot more about that than me. I would just say, though, that I think that there's a lot of specialization for different types of supply. So one of the biggest problems Bing had was dealing with Amazon as a customer and Joe's Pizza as a customer. And it was pretty hard to do all of those things right. And I think that, as you all well know, it's more than just getting the listing. With these individuals, they have to have incentives every single day to answer their email, to keep things up to date. You are asking your suppliers to reinvest every day. And that is a fundamentally different thing than getting a hotel to plug into their IT system. So I do think that whatever gets done, you don't want the people who sign up hotels to plug in their IT systems to be completely in charge of managing the individual people, because all the things I talked about today, it's hard to manage a marketplace. Its incentives are subtle, and there's no way that like a big monolithic system is going to be able to fine-tune the incentives for a property manager of vacation rentals. So however it comes together, the expertise and management that this group brings, I think, will never be replaceable by something generic.
Awesome. Okay, well, Anna, you're going to organize.
First of all, we're going to say a massive thank you to Susan and Justin for
definitely.
the session. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. We're going to take a short break, 30 minutes, back exactly past for a bridge session.
Okay.